Richard, why don't you start off telling us why now? Somalia is in the midst of a historic famine. Why now for Kenya, and what is it hoping to achieve?
Well, that's what we've been wondering about. I mean, Somalia's been in chaos for a long, long time now, but there's a number of recent events, I think, that have prompted Kenya's actions. First of all, as you say, this massive humanitarian crisis in Somalia has really spilled over into Kenya. You have the largest refugee camp in the world in Kenya, in Dadaab now, almost 450,000 people fleeing that famine. The number is about 1,000 a day of Somalis coming into that camp. So that's causing a lot of headaches for the Kenyan authorities. The second as well is, and this is I think the crucial point, that you've had a series of armed attacks on the Kenyan coast by Somalis who've been seizing European tourists and then taking them back to Somalia. Now, the tourism trade is critical for the Kenyan economy, and I think that's really what's the final straw for the Kenyan authorities who've decided to take action.
So what do you think Kenya is trying to achieve within Somalia?
Well, it's when you look at their objectives, originally they said that it was going to be a sort of short and sharp operation, but we're already, as you say, almost 3 weeks into the operation, and we're a little bit unclear on the long-term objectives. I think in essence, though, they're looking to really create some sort of buffer zone and push Al-Shabaab, this Islamist group of extremists who are in control of most of South and Central Somalia, push them as far away from the Kenyan border as they possibly can.
There's big questions about how sustainable that kind of a solution will be, I guess. Shabaab is, they may well beat back Shabaab temporarily. There's nothing at this moment to really fill that void.
And this has always been the problem in Somalia, right? The only alternative right now to Al-Shabaab is the internationally backed transitional federal government, but it doesn't really have much domestic support in Somalia. It's hopelessly corrupt. Really, it's only in control of a small part of the country, and it's really only holding the bits it does control because it has some peacekeepers from the African Union to sort of fight its battles for it. So I think, yeah, pushing out Al-Shabaab is one thing, but then if you create this vacuum of governance, then you're not really providing a sustainable solution here.
There are local authorities within these regions, and both Kenya and Ethiopia, and to a certain extent the United States, has traditionally relied on proxies in terms of trying to fill that space. The problem with that is that oftentimes these proxies are not particularly cooperative among each other, or very competitive among each other. And one of the troubles with Somalia is intervention in one way creates distorted incentives in a lot of ways. And
yeah, and I think that's definitely been the case on the Kenya-Somali border. You've had sort of efforts by the Kenyans to support a local governance authority there. They've sort of called the area Jubaland or Azania, but the problem, as you say, their proxies are kind of unreliable. Some of them were fighting with Al-Shabaab until fairly recently. There's also a potential, I think, for confrontation or squabbles between Kenya and Ethiopia, who've been backing different proxies. So there's potential for the two allies, I think, to fall out with each other during this offensive as well.
Meanwhile, there's U.S. interests in curbing the influence of Shabaab. The great fear is the possibility of recruitment of Somali Americans who may then be recruited by Shabaab to launch attacks within the United States. How do you see the Kenyan and Ethiopian offensive playing within U.S. interests and U.S. strategies in Somalia?
Well, I think it complicates things in a way. The U.S., when this operation began, people naturally thought, well, is the United States the driving force behind this operation? Well, they said quite clearly that Kenya took this action alone. It didn't brief the United States beforehand. And as you say, I think there's potential for this operation to become complicated and complicate US efforts in the region. And only last weekend we saw an American citizen supposedly launch a suicide attack inside Somalia in Mogadishu. So when we had General Ham, the commander of AFRICOM here a month ago, he said that was the the biggest security concern for him. That's the thing that kept him awake at night,
Right.
that you would get some sort of transfer of Somalis perhaps to launch attacks here in the United States as well.
I mean, it should be said that Shabaab is fairly weak. They have very little popular legitimacy in the areas in which they're in control. They're very brutal, deeply disliked. They've really been a key driver of the famine and the humanitarian crisis. So they're weak. They may be losing ground in certain ways. They've been driven out of Mogadishu by the African Union forces. Now they're kind of under assault by Kenya and Ethiopia. But the problem, again, is that there's just nothing to fill that void, as we said at the outset.
You know, Somalis might not agree on much, but one thing that really unites them and tends to anger them is outside interference. I mean, we saw this in 2006 when Ethiopia invaded. Okay, Ethiopia has traditionally been the sort of enemy adversary of Somalia. Maybe there's not that same antipathy towards Kenya, but I do think particularly at a moment when Al-Shabaab is weak, there's a danger of the Kenyan invasion being portrayed as some sort of Christian-led invasion that tends to kind of rally support for Al-Shabaab just at that moment when it was starting to look vulnerable.
In terms of risks, the possibility of civilian casualties in this, Kenya has got to be extremely careful, or this thing could backfire.